Hello everybody, and welcome to this month's IPRA Thought Leadership webinar. I'm delighted today to introduce you to Mark Giles, who is the principal of MI2 and a veteran communications professional. Mark worked for many years with the Canadian Armed Forces, where he assisted the military police and other organizations. He also advised NATO and Interpol, as well as the Federal Canadian Public Services. Mark today is going to talk to us about Impact PR, getting tough to win on the hard issues. He'll speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then I will field any questions you have for him. There's a Q&A tab to the left of the chat screen. So if you put your questions in there, that makes it easier to take them. And I look forward to seeing you in about half an hour or so. I shall leave the screen now and leave you in the capable hands of our presenter tonight, Mark.
Thank you, Philip, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I appreciate you spending a short time with me, and thanks, Philip, for the opportunity with the International Public Relations Association to present. And as I was just mentioning to Philip in our pre-presentation chat, it was actually the 2006 IPRA conference in Cairo, Egypt, on reputation management that actually was sort of a lead into some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. As Philip mentioned, impact public relations is sort of a term that I might have coined. I'm not suggesting someone else hasn't used it before. They may have. But I sort of came up with it along with what I'll talk about in a few minutes, prosecutorial public relations, sort of a tie-in to that. When I realized that perhaps from a broader perspective in communications, we needed to start looking at one aspect when we were dealing with different situations, in particular when you might have an adversary or someone that perhaps is not treating you or your organization in a very kind fashion. I have about 25 slides, but at least half of those will just be up on the screen very briefly to provide you some background or context, and I'll focus down on 8 or 9 of them where we'll talk about a little bit more of the meat of the issue here. Obviously, this is a very broad topic in the short period of time that I have here. I'll introduce you to some of the overarching strategies that I link into, and then a couple of the tactics, so we can actually drill down on those rather than looking more broadly and perhaps not being as much used to use as I could in this presentation. Very quickly there, one of those slides that I'll run through quickly, that is my background. Or at least part of my background, and Philip has already alluded to that. The last 2 and a bit decades in communications, public affairs, public relations. Realize there's a whole discussion on that terminology, and then of course a decade plus in law enforcement prior to that, which led into my work in communications later. During my career, I was very privileged to work for the Canadian Army's Influence Activities Task Force for 4 years, a year as a public affairs officer, and then 3 years as a psychological operations planner. And it's there that I learned a lot, worked with some of the colleagues there, some of the best in the world, and others in NATO. And I certainly learned a lot and realized that in the broader communications umbrella is certainly much more broad than the swath of public relations, communications, and marketing, as important as that is. I've incorporated some of that into my current work, and of course into this overview during this presentation. Traditional public relations, as the IPRA website and Philip mentioned, tends to be a little bit softer, more of the communications and marketing piece, where we're highlighting an organization, where we're putting the good news out, telling the good news stories about our organization, or if we're developing our individual brand, we're doing a very similar fashion. And of course, managing and mitigating the bad news stories, but all towards moving as quickly as possible back towards the good news stories. And where that fails sometimes is when, as I mentioned in my first slide, we end up dealing with folks that perhaps are getting a little tougher on us. And if we're not pushing back, and pushback's a bit of a euphemism, but I think it captures it nicely. If we're not pushing back in reasonable fashion, we can sometimes find there are significant hits, not only to our individual organizational reputation, but actually operational or other aspects that can cause us all kinds of problems if we're not pushing back on, sometimes on what we would call in the military incoming. And as I mentioned earlier, I sort of coined that, in addition to the impact public relations, prosecutorial public relations. Of course, in the criminal justice system, as I'm sure we're all aware, you have a defense counsel and a prosecutor. Not an exact analogy by any stretch, but today I'm going to nonetheless address what I would refer to as prosecutorial public relations. And it's perhaps could be considered, I suppose, similar in a way to the broader information operations, a term that's used quite widely and a practice that's used quite widely in military operations. Why do we need to get tough sometimes? Well, there are some of the reasons. I won't read that slide to you. I'll let you digest it quickly. But there are certainly a number of reasons why you as an individual or an organization, if they're so inclined, might need to be a little tougher in your pushback in response to some of the attacks, if you will, or actions that can be taken against you. As I'll talk about in just a minute here, bullying, that's more of an individual thing, although that can be a corporate problem. And that's sort of one of the early stages before I put MI2 together. Bullying situations that I had experienced personally and that friends of mine and others had experienced was certainly something that got me going in this area. But, more recently, to the second bullet point, had a client that basically was intimidated, if you will, or received an intimidating invoice, that they weren't expecting. In fact, what they had missed was some extremely small print and a less than transparent agreement and approach to a situation. So there are a number of different reasons why we might need to get tough. As a colleague many years ago with the Calgary Police Service once said, it's one thing for it to happen, it's quite another not to do anything about it. Not to say that we need to respond in every situation. No, sometimes we need to let things go. Sometimes we need to forgive. But there are other times, certainly, and that's a judgment call, when we're going to need to respond or we want to respond. These are just some of the elements you might want to consider if you're looking at, employing some form of impact or prosecutorial public relations or this type of action. Certainly, you might need to be comfortable with some confrontation because sometimes it's involved. And you need to be prepared or capable of putting together some of the tactics that might hopefully make you successful. And I'll talk about two quick cases of several that I've been involved in. Well, one I've been involved in, another that I became aware of later. But nonetheless, two that were quite successful in their approach and throughout the process. As I mentioned, bullying was 15 plus years ago, almost 20, something that I addressed very early on in this whole concept of impact public relations. Many years ago, I worked for an organization, and that individual is not named in these articles for a couple of reasons at the time. You have to be very careful with defamation, which I'll talk about. But this is an article that was published, one of two. I'll show you the top end of the other one in a few minutes. This one was published in December 2006 by Blue Line, Canada's law enforcement and policing magazine. I was a media and public relations columnist for them for several years. And this one pushed back quite heavily on bullying in general and a specific organization where not only had I experienced it, but many, many others who I had spoken to. In fact, my predecessors had, two of my predecessors in my position had left for the very same reason. For the outsider reading this, and I realize I've just covered the top end of this article, but for the outsider reading this article, they probably wouldn't know the organization or the individual. But internally, anyone that was working for that organization or was familiar with it certainly recognized what and who we were talking about. And this article was sent quite widely, including to a number of internal stakeholders, and of course made its way back to the individual. And it was successful, I suppose, in that after the second article, I received an apology from this individual. I'm not sure how much of a difference it made in the long term, hopefully a small dent in using what we could say was impact public relations or prosecutorial public relations to push back on negative action, or if you will, an adversary of sorts. We don't have time to discuss, terminology, which is obviously a whole session in itself, but that's what I'm looking at when I talk about strategy versus tactics. And so when I talk about impact public relations, or pushing back, if you will, it's all about making a meaningful difference using a wide variety of influence activities. And so that's going to be public relations, perhaps, some of the softer means, communications more broadly, but it's certainly going to sometimes involve harder hitting or more influential activities beyond the softer nature of straight up public relations and marketing. There's three themes there that I tend to link to. There are a couple more, but those are the main three. Predator-prey mentality, I'll highlight that in a second. Bringing it home, which is basically focusing on individuals and organizations that so they feel the impact. It's not just this sort of wide-reaching tactic that doesn't really impact anyone specifically. So you bring it home to the key players. And then, of course, transparency and the old idea, which I certainly don't suggest to have coined, but letting sunlight be the best disinfectant. That line has been used many, many times, but it's a huge theme that I'll link to. The bottom line, as the point at the bottom of the slide mentions, is simply that you want to make the costs of not doing anything, not resolving your problem, not backing off in attacks against you or your organization. You want to make the cost of that higher than any benefits that they're getting from just ignoring you and not dealing with the situation. And that's really what impact public relations is all about ultimately. Predator versus prey mentality. Often when we're under attack, we are the prey and the person attacking us. And I'm not talking physical, of course, here. We're talking communications and related tactics, or administrative actions, perhaps, or bullying, that sort of thing. The predator, of course, knows they're a predator. And flipping that around, the strategy of turning that around so that you become more predatory in nature in defending yourself is the concept here and the theme related to the last slide. So when you find yourself under attack or find yourself in a situation when you feel you may need to push back, whether that's as an individual, whether that's as an organization, I like to assess the vulnerabilities of the adversary. So it's a little military in concept for sure. The specific issues and individuals involved. I mean, and that's no different than we would do in communications generally, and even softer public relations and marketing. But then, of course, where are their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses? Are there policy violations, as I'll get to in just a minute in one case? Are there policy violations or other situations that you can highlight in your responses, in your tactics, that will make them feel vulnerable and make them more likely to resolve your issue for you? And then, as I'll also show in the second example, there are organizational sensitivities, much more broad weaknesses with this organization or who it is you are pushing back against, that you can highlight to make your case even stronger. So these are some of the tactics. As I mentioned, we have limited time here, and we're pushing halfway through the presentation. So these are just some of the tactics that we will employ or can be employed to effectively push back and achieve what I mentioned a couple of slides back, that making it beneficial, if you will, for the organization or individual causing you the problems to back off. And they can be very effective, as I'll show you in a couple of quick examples in a minute. This is the follow-on article to the first one, Top-Down Intimidation, that I wrote for Blue Line, Canada's law enforcement magazine. This one was published 2 months. It's a monthly publication, 2 months after the first one. So this one was published in February, the February edition of 2008. The first one was December 2007. And this follow-on was a result of some good and interesting feedback I got through letters to the editor online, letters and emails to the editor online, and I incorporated that into the follow-up. And again, for anyone reading this within the organization that it targeted and the individual that it targeted, they would recognize very quickly who we were talking about. This one actually caused the individual to contact the publisher of my magazine and complain after he saw the second one and wasn't sure how many more there were to come. And there might have been more to come without an apology, which was received. And my publisher backed me. He had heard, of course, I'd already briefed him with a lot of evidence on what had been going on in this organization, not just in my experience, but many other people well before me, and sadly after as well, I'm sure, from what I've heard. But nonetheless, hopefully we made somewhat of a difference with this impact PR, quote, impact PR, end quote, tactic. And one of the other tactics that that one was obviously linked to the theme of, a couple of the themes, all three of the themes, but certainly brought it home to that organization and that individual, because he recognized that other people recognized him in the article. And of course, it disinfected with sunlight in that it went out very broadly. It was published in a national magazine, and it was sent out electronically to quite a wide audience. Another tactic is the influence activities, the IA-focused news release, and there are some of the key factors to keep in mind when you're using a tactic like this. Last bullet point there to keep very closely in mind, and I'll address it here, is that of avoiding defamation, and that can be done, or at least can be mitigated significantly through being aware of what it is and realizing, of course, that the laws. Case law and otherwise, and natural law varies from country to country, state to state in the United States in some situations. But there are some basic concepts that you need to keep in mind. The third bullet there, it's opinion statements. Generally laws are much more accepting of opinion than statements of fact or other affirmations. So if you are going to put something in there as a fact, make sure that you can definitely back it up. And I will highlight this by saying any product or any tactic that you use, you want to get cleared by legal counsel. Both of those articles were cleared by legal counsel. Everything that I have done and do is cleared by my in-house legal counsel. This is one of two cases in the last few minutes we've got left here, which is a very recent one. I will actually, in just next subsequent slides, I will drill down and show you paragraph 2 and paragraph 4 a little bit closer, which might be a little easier for you to read. In a nutshell, this was a case last fall where a volunteer with the Alberta Soccer Association made some comments internally that he certainly shouldn't have made, and I told him that right away when I was retained to assist him. And nonetheless, the organization, the Alberta Soccer Association, in our view, his council, mine, and other stakeholders, went way too far in responding, put out comments to media that were, I would suggest, defamatory in nature. And therefore, we took a number of steps, a number of tactics, including here what I would suggest is an IA, or influence activities focused news release, which went out quite widely. It was one of 3 over a period of about 6 weeks. The result in this case was quite favorable for the individual. The ASA, Alberta Soccer Association, didn't back down initially. They in fact ran him through a disciplinary hearing. He was found unsustained or not guilty. They then created they changed their own policy and created a new level of appeal so they didn't have to go national. And then they lost again. And just a short time ago, the appeal period for that expired. So overall, I mean, I don't have time to go into a lot of the specifics here, but certainly the news releases were somewhat influential in that case, and they reached a wide variety of stakeholders and players, contributing, I believe, to success. Obviously, legal counsel's work was a huge part of this as well, and I don't want to detract from that. So just drilling down and linking to the theme of bringing it home, the number 2 of the 3 themes there, predator prey mentality, bringing it home being the second, the third being disinfecting through sunlight. Sunlight disinfects, transparency. So bringing it home here, of course, that news release, that IA-focused influence activities news release was cleared by legal counsel. It actually named an individual. That individual's there. Not that I'm trying to necessarily, highlight that at this point. I'm not. But I think it would be impact my credibility if I didn't at least, sort of do what I'm preaching, practice what I'm preaching here in terms of showing you the news release as one tactic that was used. You'll note, though, very carefully that we very carefully worded the news release to ensure that it did clear the legal counsel's review from a defamation perspective. The word alleged is right in the first sentence. Apparently is also there. And so we're very careful in our language, alleging where that's all the situation is. It was alleged, or we had alleged. So that is in fact accurate. And the bottom line, though, is it holds or attempts to hold, to be clear, an individual or individuals who we believe are responsible for the situation as it was laid out, as it came to pass. It holds them responsible rather than allowing individuals to just hide under cover of the organization. Certainly, an organization will take a hit, but when you're actually bringing it home where you can, very carefully, of course, then I would suggest you can have a lot more impact. Bringing it home, continue. This is paragraph number 4, and I'll let you have a quick read of that. You'll notice it's, again, very carefully worded. Apparently caused offense. Well, that would be more towards the ASA's side of things. Apparently led by that individual. Now accused of, all right, allegedly in violation of the organization. So we're being careful, just like news agencies. For those of you who have been in journalism, you know that you have to be very careful when you're dealing with situations like this and people that are accused of things. Those words must be in there. It's fair, it's ethical, and of course it hopefully avoids defamation. All right, the second of the last case that I'll talk to you about. I didn't have the lead on this one, but I became aware of it later. MI2 became aware of it later, and it was one that used some of the tactics that I've been talking about. In a nutshell, this was a young corporal in serving with the Canadian Armed Forces overseas, who, again, like the previous case with the Alberta Soccer Association, had made some comments to a senior officer, after hours in a mess, if you will, in a lounge, that he shouldn't have made. But, the response in my and other people's views was sort of an overkill, and he was pushed into a military, what's called a summary trial, local summary trial, even though he requested that he have a court-martial. A court-martial, at least in the Canadian Forces, and I believe other areas, tends to be a little more civilian style, with a record of proceedings, with a judge who's trained. So can tend to be much more fair, in my opinion. Others, I think, would agree with me, not all, perhaps. He was found guilty, and he contacted legal counsel, and there was a pro bono public relations firm that assisted him. The firm didn't want to be named, but they assisted the law firm that was named, and I've spoken to the lawyer himself. Craig Patterson and Company. He gladly wanted me to share his name on this presentation, and he was the one that was the lead in terms of communicating this IA-focused, influence activities-focused news release, which is cut off at the bottom, the journalistic 30 and the contact information I have cut off at the bottom, just so you realize it was a professionally written news release in some traditional format there. But this one was sent to National Defence Headquarters. You'll notice the date, December 20th. I'm told that the National Defence Headquarters, just pre-Christmas, as it coincidentally worked out, this incident, the timing of, was advised that they had until that date to take action to resolve what they saw as very unfair treatment of this corporal, or this news release would be sent out nationally, which of course, as it worked out, I'm told would have been a very interesting time over Christmas, where, at least traditionally, maybe a little less so in today's electronic world, but there tends to be a little bit of slower news time, so more latitude, more likelihood of this getting picked up, and less vulnerability for the organization, less public affairs and communications staff to manage and mitigate this issue. Just drilling down a little bit and linking to the theme number 2 of the 3 that I had highlighted there for you, bringing it home. The news release named 2 individuals, and not that I'm trying to, push any harder on behalf of this law firm and the pro bono public relations firm, but nonetheless, this is the news release that I'm told went out, and so I'm sharing it with you. Very carefully fact-checked. The narrative there in relation to those 2 individuals was clearly provable. okay, in terms of avoiding defamation. I think they realized that pretty quickly, which is part of the reason, among others, why they responded. The Canadian Forces responded. Being careful, though, where there's something you can't sort of, put down as a fact, to adjust your language accordingly. So right in the beginning, the trial, which was seen widely by those in attendance, okay, somewhat subjective, but I think it would be fair to say after my research that that would be a fair statement, but not delivered nonetheless as a fact. What the factual pieces in there, though, as I said, were provable, demonstrable, and therefore fair game, I would suggest, in this news release. Organizational vulnerability, we talked about assessing vulnerabilities and bringing it home not just to an individual or individuals, as I showed in the previous slide, but also to the organization. And this is the last line, last paragraph in that six or so paragraph news release, which linked to an organizational vulnerability, the Canadian Forces military justice system, which over that same period, this was in 2018, but in very recent last couple of years has gone under significant changes. I would suggest because of situations like this and many, many others. But this one brings it home to the organization and reminds media and anyone seeing it, and perhaps and narrative, depending how this was picked up. Well, it wasn't picked up because it didn't have to be distributed, but had it been picked up, would have reminded them of the organization's reputation, which was demonstrable, for doing this type of thing, or perhaps being perceived as not being fair within their justice system. The result of this was that the trial was quashed. Not only did the corporal the request was that the request, I believe, was that he would be allowed to go to court-martial in Ottawa after his tour. That didn't happen. The whole thing was just quashed, and basically as if it didn't happen. So that was a successful outcome for sure for the corporal involved, the law firm involved, and the public relations firm involved. So just wrapping this up, in summary, there's 4 bullet points that you might want to think about if you're thinking that perhaps you need to get tough in your response or your approach with an adversary, if you will, or others that you perhaps feel, or an individual or an organization is having a negative impact on you, and you want to push back. Are you willing to take some heat? That links to the confrontation, potential confrontation that I'd alluded to earlier. What are you comfortable using? I've demonstrated a couple of tactics. Those are only 2 of a number within the 3 overarching strategies: predator-prey mentality, turning that around, bringing it home to individuals or the organization through your communications. I think I've illustrated that somewhat. And then, of course, transparency and spreading that information widely, linked to the strategy or the concept that sunshine, metaphorically, sunshine disinfects. Some people argue sometimes, the ethics, and of course, ethics are also important, always important. I often will respond by saying, well, ethically, is it okay that what's happened to you or somebody else or your organization or another organization, is that fair? Is that ethical that stands? And therefore, are you confident that your actions are justified? And that, I think, addresses the ethics piece. But of course, that's a whole much larger conversation. And the last bullet point there speaks to outcomes. That's my time. That's my presentation. We're about 27 minutes in. So I will wrap it up there and open it up to any questions there may be.
Well, thank you very much for that, and a fascinating take on a part of PR that many of us have not been involved with before. Perhaps as a first question, I was just thinking about, again, so within traditional PR, you may bid for a certain client, and once you have that client, you will then hopefully do several pieces of business with them. Now, the very nature of what you do, it's not going to work like that. So I wonder, do clients come to you? Do you try to find clients by spotting unfairness or something like that? How does it work?
Well, okay, obviously before I retired, MI2 now is a business. Before I retired from the military, of course, I didn't have MI2, and any involvement that I had was on a personal basis or just assisting friends pro bono. Or in the case of the second situation there with the forces, sort of hearing about it after and saying, hey, fascinating, I need to share that. But to answer your question, a bit of both. I mean, in the case of the Alberta Soccer Association, that came to me through legal counsel that I've known for some time, who contacted me and asked me to assist. Certainly, I look for opportunities and let people know that I'm available to assist should they need my services. But it's more of a, I'm there to assist where needed. I'm not looking to work 60 hours a week, so it's not a huge marketing effort on my part.
Okay. So I have a question from Edwina, who runs her own consultancy, Gore Communications. Have you ever used open letters in addressing confrontation, and would you recommend that approach?
I'd have to think back. I've used a wide variety of tactics, but I would, open letters are really linked. I would suggest linked to the theme. Well, they can link to all three themes, but they certainly link to the theme of sunshine disinfecting. So yes, I would definitely recommend, if we're talking open letters, like open letter to the editor in the traditional newspaper, which of course are almost all online now, so it's electronic. And of course, as we all know, the reach electronically, digitally, in the last 15 years or so, especially with the advent of social media, in addition to websites and everything online, is huge. So you can get your response, get your impact, public relations, quote unquote, out there much more quickly and much more widely. So yes, I think open letters are great. They're sort of a sidebar, if you will, to the news release that just goes through more traditional media. But certainly if you can get it published, or if you have your own platform, so a website or other organizations or individuals that are willing to let you use their platforms or those social media accounts to get your open letters out there, yes, I would definitely suggest that as a good tactic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I have a question from Brett Boudreau from consultancy in Canada, in Ottawa. He refers to the tactics that you mentioned, the naming names, etc., as potentially having ethical and legal risks to them, and he wonders what are the red lines? What are those can't go to their tactics, and are they easy to spot those in advance?
Sure. Well, first, hello, Brett. I know Brett, and he was the senior public affairs officer with the Canadian Forces in my early years. A lot of respect for Brett. Definitely, there are red lines, and although some of them are, they're a little murky, like defamation. I mean, there's you want to stay clear of defamation. There are clear areas that are defamatory. And of course, the simple one there is making a statement that you can't prove, right? So if you're putting something down there as fact in your narrative, in any product, whether that's a news release, an open letter, or anything else that you're doing, you better make sure you can back that up. Otherwise, you better use much more appropriate language, and I think I've illustrated at least some of that in a couple of the illustrations that I used there. So, and I mean, ethics is a whole discussion in and of itself. And I mean, I know there are people that don't like to respond in tough, quote unquote, tough fashion at all, and that's a personal choice or an organizational choice. And I recognize that many organizations don't. I'm not suggesting that everybody can or is going to want to use impact PR, so to speak, and its strategies and supporting tactics. But as I said in my, I think, a second or third bullet point there on the summary, it comes down, I guess, to the overall good, if you will. Like when I agreed to accept the case successfully supporting the the individual pushing back against the Alberta Soccer Association, I did so realizing we were going to use some harsh tactics in doing so, but I felt that the wrong being done to this individual far outweighed anything that I would be doing to assist or push back. And therefore, in my mind, I was comfortable doing that. But I recognize that comfort level will be different for everybody.
Sure. And finally, a question refers to something you mentioned earlier in the presentation. We've seen some of the tactics that you use. You also mentioned that there may be times when you need to use out-of-the-box tactics. Have you got an example of one of those?
Well, I tend not to get into specifics on the out-of-the-box tactics. If I was to reveal sort of everything here, it would be could be problematic or make less impactful some of those tactics. I guess what I'm saying with out of the box is simply what I think I was referring to there was perhaps an out of the box approach to more traditional tactics that could have been worded perhaps slightly differently. So, for example, I mean, as Brett and others online will know, I mean, a traditional news release, and of course the formatting has changed much over the last 2 decades. But, most organizations have a specific format. They tend to be a hard news release, straight up facts, for example, with very soft influence, typically in public affairs. So out of the box would be that it's IA focused, influence activities focused. And so when we start talking about psychological operations as a huge swath of the influence activities umbrella, you would have much more harsher or harder influence built into that product, built into that news release, built into that open letter, built into that speech, built into that response of any type. So more of an out of the box approach to the varying tactics that are available, some of which I've already addressed.
Okay, and Adam just squeezed in the question at the last moment. I ask, are there typical situations or cases where Impact PR approach is advised way of communication? And do you find it obvious when you need to take this sort of approach, or does it take some study as to what the problem is first?
Well, yeah, it's obviously subjective, I think, in making that determination. I mean, I'm a big believer in being nice first. I've always, personally, interpersonally, work situations. I always believe that if you can negotiate something with a handshake, and through just, cordial, pleasant conversation, that's the way to go about it. And I will almost always approach it that way. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of other cases beyond, the one there that I showed you and the other that I'm aware of. But in almost every situation, I make the assessment, based on whether I think if it can't be resolved in a nice fashion, or I've attempted to resolve it that way, then I will look at moving towards tougher response, impact, quote unquote, impact public relations. If I think that the end justifies it, we need a different result than we're going to get by not doing anything. Like everybody, I've let a lot of things go. You can't take on everything and everybody in the world, and all the injustices that are out there. You have to be very selective.
Splendid. Well, thank you for that. I've certainly learned something today with an aspect of PR that we're not all familiar with. So thank you, Mark. That was excellent. As ever, this presentation has been recorded and it will go up on our website in a few days. So if you want to refer to it or refer it to colleagues who weren't able to make it today, then it will be there to have a look at. We're skipping next month in May because of holidays, but we come back in June with our next webinar, and that is from UK veteran PR man Tony Langham, who's going to be talking about his take on reputation management. So until then, once again, Mark, thank you very much for the presentation today. It was super. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Super. Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.